everyone. Welcome to week number 4. This week, practical applications of risk management. But before I get into the topical areas specifically for the week, I thought I'd give Gordon and Michelle an opportunity to bring up any thoughts or comments as we begin the week or how things are going so far. So I'll start with Michelle.
Great. Hello, everyone. So we're talking about operations, external and strategic risk this week, and for me, a thing called meta-gray rhinos, the systems and the structures that make it harder to deal with a particular situation is going to come up a lot across all three of the pockets this week. So I'm very excited to talk about that because I always get a lot of questions about it.
Great. Gordon?
I look at things just a little bit differently this week, and it goes back to where Michelle kicked it off in week number 1. So I'll see if I can tie these two together. Having stood in front of law enforcement audiences for 45 years, I've been getting evaluations on my work. And most of the evaluations say nice things about my work. When there's a negative comment, there's a pattern. 3 things that people don't like. Number 1, he didn't give us enough breaks. That's absolutely true. Number 2, I found some of the things he said very offensive. Okay, then grow up. The one that bothers me, though, is he's a very negative person. And we need more positive speakers in law enforcement. We need more positive speakers in public safety. He's a very negative person. If I come across as being negative in this class, that's my fault. I have failed. The truth is, the vast majority of things you do in law enforcement, in the fire service, in corrections, in all of the jobs we put in public safety, the vast majority of things that you do, you're doing right. There's a reason why things are going right. On those rare occasions when things don't go right, there are significant consequences. I've probably already said this. This is not making ice cream. This is not selling real estate. When things don't go right in public safety, people die, including our people. When things don't go right, people get hurt, including our people. When things don't go right, there's organizational, personal, professional embarrassment that embarrasses the entire profession, not just the involved department. There are lawsuits when things don't go right. There's a loss of public trust when things don't go right. Most of what you do, you're doing right. There's a reason why. We will explore that later. On the rare occasion when things don't go right, there's also a reason why. And those are the things that I'm trying to focus on so we can better assure things get right. And again, making excellence the norm, not the deviation. So as we go through today and on week 5, and by the way, week 4, that's 50%. We are halfway there, ladies and gentlemen. Lots of things going on. But in week 5, we'll continue this conversation on why things go right and wrong. There's a reason why. So back to you, Jay.
All right, Gordon, thank you very much. And as Michelle noted, this week, the families you'll be discussing are operational, external, and strategic. A little bit operational, as Gordon just said, why do things go right and why do they go wrong in the organization? He'll talk about the value of systems, their design, update, and implementation. And I know that systems are critical. I've learned a lot from Gordon in that regard. We're going to talk a little bit about external risks, some of the most challenging you're going to face. They could be weather, terrorism, criminal gangs, environmental issues, railroad, estates, you name it. The external risks are one of your high risk areas. And then you're going to spend some time this week talking about strategic. Where will your agency be 30 years from now? And what will the impacts of regionalization, consolidation, and privatization and outsourcing be? And lastly, what will be the impact of technology, international conflicts, and other game changers? It sounds like there's a great session coming, and to get this thing kicked off, I'm going to start first going to Gordon, and we'll talk operational risk. Gordon, all you.
Thanks very much. And taking off on what I just said, the vast majority of things that you do, you are doing right. And I'm looking for this thing here. It should be kicking in. Oh, darn it. It's not working. Just a second. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. There it is. The vast majority of things you do, you're doing right. And that's something that everybody needs to know. As I referenced, when things don't go right, there are significant consequences. The injuries, the deaths, the embarrassments, the internal investigations, the loss of public trust, the lawsuits, and all of these are the domain of our lawyers. So if you want to have some fun with your city attorney or your county council, walk up to them and say this: how many ways are there for people in our organization to get in trouble? How many ways are there for people in our organization to get in trouble? And I guarantee you this will be the response from your city attorney, from your county council. So your question to me is, how many ways are there for people to get in trouble? Is it clarity? Is that what they want? No. It's all billable hours. If they can repeat questions, they can double their billable hours. Well, law enforcement's very complex. The fire service is very complex with thousands of things we ask people to do. Every one needs to be done right. So the answer to your query, the vast majority, how many ways are there to get in trouble? It's in the thousands. Well, the second I tell you there's 1,000 ways to get in trouble, you throw your hands up. We can't address thousands of things. The job is just too complex. The question needs to be modified, because when you ask a lawyer that question, all they focus on is proximate cause. If you ask a real risk manager that question, they'll look at it a little differently. There's two ways we get in trouble: intentional misconduct, somebody did something bad on purpose, or negligent conduct, somebody made a mistake. Yes, there are thousands of proximate causes, but let's look for the real problems lying in wait. And when you get the handout material, which is posted on Canvas, you'll note that I further subdivide this into externally generated and internally generated problems. Very quickly, because we're going to cover this in greater detail on Tuesday night, some of our problems come from external intentional misconduct. That's where bad people, not employed by your agency, do bad things on purpose. Terrorism is a form of external intentional misconduct. Arson is a form of external intentional misconduct. Killing a cop is a form of external intentional misconduct. And I don't want to rain on your parade, but it's very difficult to stop bad people from behaving badly. I will give you some strategies on Tuesday night. Some of our problems come from internal intentional misconduct, where our own people do bad things on purpose. Personnel who lie, cheat, steal, perjure, beat, molest, rape, assault, embezzle, and everything I've just said there has happened on the CHP, and everything that I've just said there has happened in every state across the country. Bad people doing bad things on purpose. Well, Gord, how do we address that? Well, if you hire bad people, sooner or later they're going to behave badly. So when we talk about recruitment and retention and performance evaluations, that's part of the equation. Some of our problems come from external negligence, where otherwise good people make honest mistakes. The example I use for years, a form of external intentional misconduct, is arson. And I have seen entire forests burned down because of external intentional misconduct. Well, let's take four nuns in a Ford Pinto who drive off the roadway to look at the flora and fauna with a hot muffler. They can cause as much problems with no ill intent. That's external negligence. The most common form of external negligence that negatively impacts public safety people is in vehicle operations. And on Tuesday night, I will give you some great strategies and tactics to address vehicle operations. But when you really study these and say, where do they start? Occasionally here, here, and here, but most of these start right here, where our own people make mistakes. You can call them errors, omissions, lapses, stupidity. You can call it anything you want. This is why I am so high on the discipline of risk management. It is very difficult to stop external behaviors. It's very difficult to stop intentional behaviors. Internal error. If we can understand where error is going to occur in any given job, then we can put together control measures to address that error. And that's going to be a big part of Tuesday night. So I'm really looking forward to delving down a little bit deeper in that, but I'll toss it over to Michelle for any comments that she might have.
Great. Thanks, Gordon. What a great way to kick off. So I want to talk a little bit more about meta gray rhinos. The things, most gray rhinos are things that are coming at you at whatever speed from whatever distance for whatever reason, and give you a chance to respond. And what part of the analysis is figuring out what obstacles are in the way of understanding, as Gordon was mentioning, what gets in the way and what does it take to respond properly. And so one of the things that does get in the way are things that we've talked about in recent weeks about biases, about decision-making, organizational culture. I think, also, really sort of the operational procedures and things. These are what I call meta gray rhinos, is that they're the big structural and process factors and the operational factors that get in the way of responding to something quickly. And these could be all sorts of things, how you make decisions, the organizational chart and structure, how does that flow? Do people have enough autonomy to make the decisions they need to make in the field? And do they have enough training and education to do it right? And are they getting clear signals from the top? So, decision making, human capital. Are you training people? Are you giving them the information that they need? Are you giving them the right information? There's a lot of organizations where people say, oh, it's just stupid the way we do these things, and that doesn't change. And so organizational inertia can be a meta gray rhino. Resources, huge for so many of the first responders that I've spoken with. How you can get the equipment that you need, the technology, the cars, the response equipment, and things like that. That's hugely important, and the overtime if you need. And that really comes down to political will. So you can see some of these meta gray rhinos are stacked on top of each other. You're not going to get the budget until the politicians are on board with giving your agency the money that it needs to do what it needs to do. Communications, we've talked about. How do you communicate to make sure that people know what they're supposed to do? I lately have been just amazed that, when you say something 4 times, clearly in slightly different ways, in writing, in speaking, in individual conversations, and still people somehow come back and they say, how do I do this? And even when you think you've done everything right with communications, it still often doesn't work right. So communications can be a meta gray rhino. And then finally, stakeholder relationships, which we've talked about as well, and we'll talk about a lot more. We've talked about why it's important to have stakeholder relationships before you need them urgently. So have you done all the background work to make sure that you are ready when the problem comes up, so that the meta gray rhino doesn't run right in between you and the solution? And so, as Gordon mentioned, external risks are really one of the hardest families to deal with here, whether it's weather, terrorism, criminal gangs, environmental, railways and other interstates, high risk industries, things like that. So I am going to throw the ball back to Gordon to talk a little bit more about those.
Well, watch me flip it over to Jay real quick, Michelle, because I'm very good at this. Hey, Jay, the community engagement class at the MPS program, is that a required one or is that elective?
That's a required course for us.
Because what Michelle just said is absolutely crucial. You've got to have those relationships up front. You've got to have those relationships up front. And let me go off topic for a second here. One of the beauties on the California Highway Patrol is we are extremely decentralized. 105 offices, yet it runs like a very nice Swiss watch, because every area commander has a key contact program. If you don't get anything else out of this little mini tape that we're preparing for Tuesday night, the key contact program. Every commander on a weekly basis has got to contact certain elected officials, certain leaders in the community, certain church leaders, certain people, and just talk to them. Just talk to them about what's going on in their community. Establish those relationships up front. That is absolutely essential. So when you have a major event where you need some advice, this is not the first time you've called them. And again, I'll just extend this a little bit further. The California Highway Patrol is one of the few major law enforcement agencies that is not a 24-hour-a-day operation. We have services on the street 24 hours a day, but our facilities shut down at 5 p.m. So between 5 p.m. and 6 a.m., when everything starts up again, there essentially is nobody's doing anything at the headquarters level. Well, we have a group of people at headquarters that collects data all night long from around the state. Fatal accidents, major events, CHP participation in things. And in the morning, the commissioner gets there very early and calls all of those key contact people directly and says, we had a quadruple fatal. All the facts are not in, but it appears to be alcohol related. We did this, we did this, we did this, constantly giving them a heads up as to what's going on. And this pays off unbelievably in the contacts around the state. So when the CHP needs something, we know exactly who to call. And that has nothing to do with our topic now, but building on Michelle's point there, without those key relationships, you are lost. As I mentioned probably several times in there, that woman who was running London Metropolitan, my job is to know my community before I need to know them. And if you're waiting for the tragedy to occur, that's way, way, way too late. But as I referenced, most of what you're doing right. There's a reason why. When things don't go right, there's a reason why. And it gets down to these issues here. And as Michelle said, the external behaviors are extremely difficult to address. If someone wants to light an arson fire, they can pull it off. If somebody wants to kill a cop, they can pull it off. Well, Gordon, is there anything we can do? On Tuesday night, we will explore two topics. One is called vigilance, and one is called random irregularity. Vigilance. The vigilance our great nation had 23 years ago on September 11th, we've lost that vigilance. Bazerman and Watkins talked about this in the book, and Michelle knows Mr. Bazerman very well. You know, America, terrorism, and complacency. It's not going to happen again. If it does happen, it won't happen here. If it happens here, it won't be a big deal. If it ends up being a big deal, it won't negatively impact me. If it ends up being a big deal that negatively impacts me, there's nothing I could have done to prevent it. All of that is nonsense. We've got to bring back the vigilance. Absolutely essential. If you want to read something interesting, and I'll just mention this very quickly, the Fort Dix Six, six active Al-Qaeda operators in New Jersey, 2005, 2006, making plans to blow up Army Base Fort Dix. Well, Gordon, I haven't heard about that. That's because they got caught in advance. They got caught in advance right before they were going to do their nasty deeds. They got caught in advance. And after the arrest, they searched their house and they found their plans on how to get into the Army base. Pizza delivery vehicles. You know, they studied their intended target, Fort Dix, in 2005, 4 years after September 11th, when the pizza delivery vehicles came up to the gate, the guards waved them through. Did we wave them through on September 12th? No. We were vigilant back then. We've lost the vigilance. We've got to bring back the vigilance. The second issue is random irregularity. Random irregularity, for anybody with an engineering background, intentional variance. If you are eating at the same place every day at the same time, that's a problem that can be easily exploited, or a behavior that can be easily exploited. If you are responding to calls and parking at the same spot every time, all bad people do is study their intended target and look for patterns they can exploit. Within your standardized best practices, build in a little bit of random irregularity. But most of our problems do not start here. Nor do most of our problems start here. Internal intentional misconduct. And I already mentioned all the bad things. But on Tuesday, we'll explore in a little greater detail about people on recruitment, backgrounds, probation, performance evaluations, and decertification, how these things can assist us eliminating the internal intentional misconduct. The external negligence, if you want to visit a website between now and Tuesday, it applies to everybody in public safety, respondersafety.com. A good friend of mine out of Maryland, Steve Austin, and not the $6 million man. And for you young kids watching this, you're going to have to look it up, $6 million man. Steve Austin is a volunteer firefighter, and he's put together a website called respondersafety.com. And there are some phenomenal control measures on respondersafety.com to help prevent these roadway events. The one I'm most concerned of is what they call roadway incursions. There's not a day that goes by that somebody in public safety is not struck by passing traffic. That's a serious event. Oftentimes they end up in fatals. This is not sneaking up on us, ladies and gentlemen. This again is an identifiable risk and a manageable risk. But most of our problems start here, and we will beat this to death on Tuesday night. How many control measures we have in place to address the internal error. So that's where we're headed with why things go right, why things go wrong. Jay, back over to you for a second. What did I miss?
Gordon, I think you got most of the key points in there. The only thing I want to check back on, Michelle, any thoughts? You had a note here for the meta rhino in this area as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there are all sorts of things that come in quite commonly, and many of these are things that you may or may not be able to control. In some cases, relationships can help you to control them, and in other cases, it's thing to be aware of. Extreme weather. We're seeing dramatic changes in weather patterns these days. In coastal areas, we're seeing hurricanes and flooding in river areas. We're seeing droughts. We're seeing wildfires. We're seeing a much higher incidence of these things than we used to. And I still marvel every time I get a little text from the Cook County alert system here in Chicago that, oh, there's wildfire risk today, and it blows me away because I'm in a big city. But a little bit further out, you've got a lot of grasslands and other places where it really could be a risk. And we've had a lot of drought. We sort of alternate between drought and flood. They had to, they've had to reverse the Chicago River, to re-reverse it a number of times to keep stormwater from inundating the city. So I think that's important to think about in terms of the right ability to respond. Terrorism. We've just been talking about some of the Al Qaeda, the Islamist, jihadist terrorism that we had around 9/11. And a lot of that has changed. You look at some of the FBI reports and some of the other data and tracking, and that's switched to angry young incel men or white supremacist, white nationalists. The data shows that that's what people are really concerned about. So we need to make sure that we're not fighting yesterday's battle, that we're fighting today's, and we are anticipating tomorrow's. So on criminal gangs, one of the big things that I saw during the post 9/11 period, when I was doing a lot of work on immigration and security and bringing together local, state, federal, and international security groups with immigration groups and business groups, were all affected by the post 9/11 changes in immigration law and security policies. We had a lot of complaints from local police groups that there were times when they were concerned with criminal gangs, with this sort of usual local challenges to police and public safety, but the federal agents were coming in very concerned about the mosques, the potential for terrorism, and they were destroying some of the relationships that the local police depended on to prevent both common crime and to prevent some of these, big terrorist related problems. They needed people to be able to tip them off. So in some situations, the federal local relationship can be a medic gray rhino getting in the way of effective work. Environmental issues, or lots of changing regulations, and going back again to extreme weather. Railways and interstates, there's lots of things going on outside of your control, but you want to have good relationships with the with the Department of Transportation, with the neighboring and sometimes even farther jurisdictions, people bringing things in. In Chicago, we have a lot of problems with, say, guns from Indiana coming in. And so you want to make sure that you're looking beyond just what's in front of you, although you don't want to take your eyes off of what's in front of you, of course. Prisons, high-risk industries, similarly. There's a serious culture challenge. In those, it might be how closely people within the company or within the prison, what sorts of procedures they're following, what sort of culture they have. And also, with prisons, you often don't have control over who's sent there from other parts of the state. So there are many cases where you need to look a little bit more broadly to the kind of relationships that you want to maintain, so that you can keep these other forces from overcoming your ability to respond.
Michelle, you nailed it. But what really troubles me is, on a statewide basis, California is almost 1,000 miles long. I can understand the lack of communication. But what really bothers me is a small organization, why people are not talking to each other in that small organization where you meet each other every day, and yet there's no free flow of information, where people are hoarding information for all the reasons we talked about earlier, people not sharing information because information is power, and false information. That is so troubling when it's not, you can't even talk to each other in the same building. But there are some roadblocks there that I think we can knock down those roadblocks. Jay, what are we missing?
So as I listened to both of you, you talked about external risk and we talked about operational risk. The next one we're going to talk about is one that I think sort of runs its way through or weaves its way through our entire program. And that's the one about strategic. Where are you going and how are you going to get there? So one of the questions that's posed here, and this starts with you, Gordon, is where will your agency be 30 years from now? Very forward thinking.
Yeah, well, the first thing I want to recommend, that I don't get one nickel for telling you this, is Police Futurists International. And I talked about this last week. PFI, a good bunch of people who are talking about the future of American law enforcement. And there's some very smart people on there who are talking about where we're going to be. And if you are, I'm being very courteous here, if you are so naive as to think, well, things will be pretty much the same. Everything Jay said in kicking off this block here, regionalization, consolidation, outsourcing, technology, privatization, these things are real risks. I suspect that in 30 or 40 years, we're not going to have 18,000 law enforcement agencies. Remember, 70 some odd percent of our law enforcement agencies nationally are less than 10 cops. And with all the mandates at the state level and the federal level, and all the mandates that are coming down in every state regarding accreditation and all the paperwork that needs to be done to achieve that, you're going to see a lot of regionalization and consolidation. I have absolutely nothing to base this on except for what's going on in my head. But I think the sheriffs are going to be the big dogs in 40 years. They are going to be gathering more and more control, particularly in the states where sheriffs have a lot of power. But you're also going to see a lot of smaller agencies getting together. And by the way, the beauty of never using PowerPoint, and I disdain PowerPoint, is that I never know what's going to pop into my head. If you don't get anything else out of this mini lecture, leave with this. If you ever absorb a smaller agency, full background checks on everybody you're bringing on board. Well, Gordon, they've already gone through a background check. How many times have I heard that? Before you hire them in your organization, full background checks. The CHP was directed by the governor in the 90s to absorb the California State Police. And the California State Police did not want that to happen because they knew there was going to be background checks. So part of the deal with the governor's office was no background checks. And while they were only 500 in number, many of those people were very troubled. Some of them had worked for the California Highway Patrol. They got fired for misconduct. They went to the state police. They moved up in the state police, and they came back to supervise the person who fired them 5 or 6 years prior. And it was just a mishmash of problems. The background investigations are absolutely essential if you're going to be absorbing smaller agencies. And that applies to everybody that comes across. So that's one issue on this consolidation. But I think we're going to see a lot of this. On the fire service side of things, it's interesting. We call them the fire department. We call it the fire department. Los Angeles City Fire Department. Newport Beach Fire Department. Well, let's check the data. Let's go down to the dispatch center. 85, 90% of their calls have nothing to do with putting the wet stuff on the red stuff. 90% of their calls are what? Medical. Who died and put the fire department in charge of medicine? Well, Gordon, it's always been that way. No. Back in the 50s, firefighters fought fires. Firefighters fought fires. And one day, a bunch of firefighters read the newspaper. Hey, you read this? This guy invented smoke detectors. What? How do they work? Building gets hot, smoke goes up, sets off alarm, puts out fire. Oh, we better whack this guy quick. That's no good. Oh no, it's too late. They got composite building materials. They got roofs that don't burn. They got new electrical codes. They got new building codes. We're going to be out of work. Don't panic. There's got to be something we can do to keep this scam going. Working one day, taking 6 weeks off. There's got to be something we can do. What other needs does our public have that nobody else is giving them? And way back in the 60s, if your dad had a heart attack, how'd you get medical treatment for your dad? You call an ambulance. What a lot of you don't know is most ambulances back in the 60s were owned by who? Funeral homes. Well, that was always comforting. Which way you guys headed? Or you could call county ambulance and wait a week, or you put dad in the front seat of the 51 Plymouth Cranbrook and watch him die on the way down to the hospital. Firefighters were brilliant. What other needs does our public have that nobody else is giving them? Why don't we bring the hospital out to dad in the form of paramedic services? And here we are 50 years later, that is their bread and butter. Well, guess what? guess what? You're going to have to reinvent yourselves again because all of this is changing. Law enforcement, we need to reinvent ourselves. What are we doing? What are we all about? Are there better ways to do this stuff? And in the future, I think we're going to see a lot of very, very substantial changes. Just yesterday, I had exposure to a massive DFR program, drones as first responders. Holy moly, very impressive operations. The value of those uncrewed aerial systems in first responder activities where they can tell us what's going on. They can send a drone into a house underneath a bed to check for suspects and then bring it back out. Yesterday, if you read the newspaper, we had a robotic dog up in Massachusetts attacked by a bad guy. Not only did that save the dog's life, a real dog's life, but it also saved some cop's life. So we're going to see a lot of changes in that stuff. And please, don't be so locked into that won't work here, that won't work here. Listen to what's going on. There's always a better way to do things, and we've got to be able to move quickly when these new technologies come present. Really exciting times.
That is some exciting stuff. Now, thinking about, I'm going to make it easy for you, Michelle. We're talking about strategic objectives. And so I'm sure you can answer this for us. What will the impact of technology be? Internal conflicts and other game changers we can anticipate coming down the pike?
Yeah, well, I just have to reiterate the danger of these words. That's how it's always been. We've always done it that way. Drives me crazy whenever I hear anyone saying that about any organization. So I'm super glad that Gordon brought that up. Technology, we've already seen huge changes. Expect that in the future on steroids, things that we don't know. We know to expect what you don't expect. But looking at cyber hacking, that's getting easier and easier for the bad guys because they can get into they break passwords much easier. We've already seen the influence of dash cams and other cameras on policing. I think we're going to see more of that, but we're also going to have problems with deep fakes and you never know what's coming out and what's true and what's not. So that's going to be a big challenge, particularly for public safety agencies who depend on how information gets out and how the public perceives it. So viral misinformation going to be a very big problem. We talked about the robo dog. I've seen stories about some firefighters, firefighting departments using robot firefighting equipment, which is great. That has the potential to save so many lives. And you all saw that. Well, I don't know if you did or not, but RoboCop years and years and years ago. We may very well see the real life version of that. And what's that even going to look like? And wearable tech and things like that. So lots going on. And as far as international conflicts, those spill across borders in crazy ways. We've seen in Chicago lots and lots of traffic jams because of people protesting the situation in Gaza or whatever situation before that. We can't escape inside the U.S. what's going on in the rest of the world. And I think that can also create all sorts of other conflicts that we need to be aware of, and other conflicts, terrorist situations, violence between pro this and con that protesters. So there's a lot going on, and that on top of all of the organizational changes that Gordon mentioned. Scenario planning is a tool that I use a lot and encourage other people to use as well. As do some thinking about some of this. A scenario planning workshop with some of your constituents, with some of your partners. Take a day off and really use your imaginations and think about what could be going on. I remember doing an exercise in 2006, 2007 on scenario planning where people actually anticipated the rise of the sharing economy and some of the economic challenges that we've been dealing with and some of the price pressures. So would very, very much encourage you to take some time to think about those things. One of the people I wrote about in Gray Rhino was a Los Angeles consultancy called 100 Years. And oh, I don't have it on my desk right now, but I normally have, because I did a little house cleaning, but it's just like a little hourglass that gives you 15 minutes. Take, 15 minutes at whatever regular interval. I'm going to sit and think strategically, think longer term, and do that on a bigger scale within your organization on a on a bigger scale and more often. So absolutely important to do.
All right.
Funny here, Michelle. Everybody's got one of these. It's a calculator built into your phone. The joy of being 73 years old is long before we had calculators. This is what I used in college and high school. The old slipstick, commonly known as a slide rule. Hey, Michelle, give me 2 3-digit numbers at random.
286
286
and 595.
595. 170,170. How about that? I have no clue how this thing works. I did the math before that on my calculator, but actually there was a time when I knew how these things work. We put a man on the moon with these things in my lifetime. And look where we are today with artificial intelligence and computers, and the computing power in this iPhone is now more powerful than what they had on the space shuttle. This is absolutely phenomenal where we are. And if you're a big fan of Moore's Law, where they said decades ago, every 2 years, technology is going to double in capabilities. And then they reduced every 1 year, technology is going to double. And now they're talking with AI that it could be multiples of 500 times per year where technology will increase. 500 times per year. Where we are and where we're going to be. Please keep an open mind here, folks, and listen to what's going on. I got so much exposure yesterday just with this DFR program, learned so much about the value of this and how it can better protect our personnel and better protect our communities. And don't say no to this stuff.
Yeah, and actually just to wrap up on that is that, I think about the increasing dependency on all of these technological tools, which means that if things go down, so much else goes down. And I look at, electric grids, at cell phone tower grids, at all this information, at the internet. And, they try to decentralize this as much as possible so that if part of it goes down, the rest won't. But, I was in New York City in what was it, 2012, 2013, the great blackout in the Northeast. I remember getting blisters on my feet from walking from the West Village all the way up to my apartment on the Upper West Side, because good luck getting a taxi. And, I look at how much more complicated that is, just in very few years. And, we're really facing a lot. So the hackers are getting stronger, and the systems are getting more and more complicated and dependent. And so just expect the challenges that we have today, but on steroids.
Yes.
Michelle, in our leadership class last night, as I listened to both of you, we spent a lot of time last night talking about 2 flights. One flight that ended disastrously and one flight that was able to recover, and it came down to total dependency on automation. One of the flights, the people had gotten so dependent on the automation that when things went south on them, they were reactive and not proactive in their response, and it had fatal outcomes. And the second flight that we spoke to, while they still had complications, they had the concept of mental modeling. And they work through problems, and it's a little bit about your scenario base, how important it is to think of the what ifs and constantly work through problems. So when they had the same type of situation, they weren't just reactive. They already had some concept of where they wanted to go. So I think those are great points. At this point, for everybody in the class, I think Michelle and Gordon have given you some lots to think about as you talk about the risk families for this week, operational, external, and strategic. And they'll delve deeper into these topics during the live session. As we move forward, though, I'd like to have both of you just take a couple minutes and maybe give some thoughts on the readings that you had for this week, either Michelle or Gordon on Michelle's book, and then maybe just a little bit about the highlights from the risk book. So either one.
Well, General McChrystal and Sandra Ruchico, I mean, these people are brilliant. And as I started talking about last week, you've got to separate yourself from, yeah, it's a military story, and look at the applicability to your fire department, to your police department, to your sheriff's department, to your public safety agency. As they talk about things, substitute what they're talking about in terms of helicopters for a fire truck, or what they're talking about in terms of a command vehicle, in terms of one of our command vehicles, and put yourself in those shoes and be able to juxtapose in your head how this would work in our world. Because those are not just stories about military operations, they're stories about life. There's always different proximate causes, but the problems lying in wait, the lack of communication, the fatigue, the hubris, the distractions, all of those things are common in high-risk industries. So as you read those stories, make it applicable in your head how it would work in your agency. That's my Nichols for on the great readings from McChrystal.
Excellent. Thank you, Gordon. Michelle?
Yeah, and the readings in your risk are about how different groups of people respond to different risks. It sort of builds on some of what we've been talking about. Your own risk fingerprints, about risk culture in organizations, and I think the key message is don't make assumptions about people, and have open conversations about your own relationships with risks. And then just a couple points on the McChrystal readings is one about, action is about overcoming inertia. And this is really very similar to the shift from a muddling to a diagnosing mode in gray rhino theory. You go from, okay, what's in the way of you challenging the status quo? And then what does it take to make it happen? And then on timing, I was just fascinated to read the account of Hurricane Katrina and what it said about risk immune systems, that, there were jurisdictional problems, communications lapses, biases, real hesitancy to make tough decisions. And a lot of those were part of the reasons why, even though there had been a scenario planning exercise weeks before Hurricane Katrina on Hurricane Pam, which was extremely similar, it's why they didn't act quickly, even though they had everything right there at their fingertips, and didn't do that. So I wrote a bit in the Gray Rhino about Hurricane Katrina and that Hurricane Pam exercise. So it was just fascinating to me to see that from a slightly different perspective, and I think a little bit deeper on the why, with some of the specifics of the case, why they didn't do what they shoulda, coulda done. And I try to avoid the woulda, shoulda, couldas, but in this case, yeah, they woulda, shoulda, coulda.
I know how inundated our students are with all the reading they've got to do, but the pre-mortems on Katrina were just shocking. How much could have been prevented with just a little bit of effort, just a little bit of communication could have obviated so many of those problems. The pre-mortems were very valuable on that, and every civic leader needs to read those things to make sure, geez, if anything like that ever happened here, and it doesn't have to be a flood, it could be a plane crash, it could be something completely unrelated to floods. How are you going to respond to these things? Are your people properly cross-trained? Do your people know where the keys are to the buses? I mean, the very basic stuff. With all of our technology now on getting passes into a building with key cards, et cetera, do first responders have key cards for these buildings? Or are they going to be stymied and not be able to get into a building because of these technologies? That upfront communication is absolutely essential.
Well said.
All right, some great thoughts and comments on the readings and the topics for tonight. So as we get ready to close out for this week, I just give any final thoughts either for Michelle or Gordon before we move on. I'll go with Michelle first.
I'm really looking forward to chatting with all of you on Tuesday night and hearing some of your takeaways from the reading, some of the questions, some of the aha moments that you've had. We really want to hear from you, because the more you share, the more you learn, and the more fun it is for everyone.
Right. Thank you.
Just my closing comment, and this is apolitical, but we have an election coming up later on this year. I know I'm not supposed to date it. When you vote, remember this: politicians worry about the next election, statesmen and stateswomen worry about the next generation. And that's on both sides of the aisle. Look at people who are thinking into the future. Where are we going to be, rather than worrying about just getting reelected? Because we have some significant problems, but these things are not sneaking up on us, ladies and gentlemen. They're identifiable risks, they're manageable risks, and working together, we can solve these things.
Great, Gordon. Thank you very much. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this session for this week. I thank you for viewing the mini lecture. Look forward to seeing you in the live session later in the week, and have a good rest of the week.